Hey, what's up, everyone? It's Ron from the Box and One podcast. With the Major Leagues elevating the Negro Leagues to Major League status, we sat down with Dr. Raymond Doswell, who's the Vice President and Curator at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City, Missouri, to discuss African Americans in baseball and their impact. If you're enjoying our content, make sure you subscribe to our channel on YouTube and hit the little bell for notifications whenever we put anything new out. You can also listen to us in audio form on any major podcast streaming platform. Also, make sure you follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Box and One Pod and leave us comments or likes on anything that we put out. So, without further ado, let's get into it.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Box and One. I'm Azam Faruqi with my co-host Ron Salgado. Pramit Bose is on DL this week. He's unavailable, so he should be back for our next episode. So our episode today is a little bit different than what we usually do. We're very excited that we have an amazing guest with us today, Raymond Doswell, who is the Vice President and Curator at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. So we just thought that it would probably be a good opportunity for us to learn and bring some new perspective to our listeners as well. I know that both Ron and I were discussing that as part of our research, there was a lot of learning for us as well. So we're very excited about that. So thank you for coming on our show, Raymond.
Glad to be here.
So let's start off right at the early days. If you can talk about the African American community, how did they take up baseball, and how did that evolve and eventually led towards the creation of the Negro Leagues?
So, historians have noted that African Americans have been present at the inception of the game in many ways. Well, first, as slaves, they certainly saw the earliest forms of ball and stick games that were being played across the country that ultimately evolved into what will become baseball and the modern rules of baseball. They have noted that some of the earliest African American professional games or even recorded games of black teams is as early as 1859. Um, Now, baseball is popular among many ethnic groups inside the United States as it evolves and as the country becomes more industrial and more urban in particular. Uh, Various ethnic groups love baseball, and some would say that baseball was an interesting reaction to industrialization, in that in our large urban centers in the United States and across North America, you've got these folks huddling in the large cities, but crowded into somewhat small spaces when you think about the different ethnic neighborhoods that pop up, and the industrial smokestacks from the different companies and different things that these communities ended up being built around. And yet baseball became a popular sport first in the upper crust, and then to our urban folks, again, of all ethnic backgrounds and socioeconomic backgrounds. And then as it became kind of an industrialized urban amusement in its own right, but with these large fields of green grass, and it harkened back to a pastoral time, that baseball became an escape from the industrialized city in many respects, and that was why it became so popular. And this was not untrue for African Americans as well, living in places like New York and Chicago and Boston and other places. Um, Grew up watching and loving baseball, particularly in places like Philadelphia, where there were a lot of black teams. One team in particular was the Philadelphia Pythians. The Pythians of the 1870s, 1880s were led by a man named Octavius Catto. And Catto was actually a civil rights leader in that era as well. They tried to apply for membership in what was then considered a major league or association of their regional leagues of white baseball teams at the time. And although they had some support, the majority of delegates at this meeting that was held did not want to accept them as a team, to the point that they actually didn't want to even vote, so that it wouldn't appear that they were racist in many respects. But they were denied entry into those leagues. But teams like the Pythians and others continued to grow and build independently and travel all across the East and in the Midwest, and then sometimes in the Southeast as well. A lot of groups of ball players would even organize in places where they worked, like hotels. They would be made up of hotel waiters, and sometimes they would play, maybe even entertaining the fans, or at resorts like in Florida, where players would go down to Florida, work at the resorts, but then organize teams, and they would play each other or play against other resorts, or occasionally even white teams. And this is kind of before baseball spring training is in Florida, although that would soon come later. They could also go to places like Cuba or Puerto Rico and play baseball by this time. But by the late 1800s, there was this push for a little bit more professionalism, and there were lots of baseball teams popping up, African American teams traveling here and there, playing all levels of competition, some of them claiming to be the best teams, the colored champions, and things like that. But there's no way to really settle that on the field without league structure, meaning these teams getting together, playing common opponents on a regular schedule, maybe playoffs, maybe some revenue sharing, determine a champion at the end of the season. And there were attempts in the late 1800s to create leagues, but none were very successful. By the time you get to 1900, there were actually a handful of individual black players who were playing in the so-called major leagues with white teams, a handful of them. Most notably, Moses Walker and his brother Weldy Walker from Ohio had played in what would be considered major league teams. There were even a few guys before that, but the Walker brothers couldn't hide their ethnic identity, whereas previous players could. And they had some success after some consternation, but even they were pushed out of the leagues, and a handful of others were pushed out of so-called white major league and minor leagues. There was never a written rule that said that they could not play, just collusion that kept them out, what historians have generally referred to as the gentleman's agreement, that kept players from being recruited. And so in that mix, and with the lack of league structures, teams would start and stop, leagues would start and stop. And by 1900, there weren't any blacks in the major leagues, but there were still more black teams being formed all the time. And independent teams, most notably teams like the Chicago American Giants under the leadership of Andrew Foster, Rube Foster is his nickname. A giant of a man, both as a baseball athlete and as a businessman later, forming the American Giants, and other teams would, and mostly in the Midwest, would also follow. But they didn't have that league structure. Now, a couple of points before getting to the beginnings of what we consider the Negro Leagues in 1920, some things are happening. Black baseball teams are competing. The black press is pushing them for organization. By the time you get to World War I mean, all kinds of things are happening, like the so-called Spanish flu epidemic around the world, which affects everyone, including sports. Right after that, there is the so-called Red Summer in the United States, which really lasts about 2 years. And this is a series of just vicious racial violence that's happening in the United States. In part, not solely, but in part because of the end of the war. What's happening at the end of the war is black soldiers are coming back from the war, having fought gallantly for the United States, looking for rights, looking for freedom, while others are concerned about them asking for freedom. Perhaps they maybe picked up some lessons from the Bolshevik Revolution and things like that. And so there's this resistance that's happening, and race riots explode in places like Texas and East St. Louis, Illinois, and Chicago, Illinois, and Arkansas, and just a wave of racial violence. And this is over 100 years ago, sounding very similar to what we're dealing with today. Out of that, though, comes the new Negro movement and the Harlem Renaissance, a sense of race pride, both self-reliance, art, jazz, all these things explode. The Marcus Garvey movement going back to Africa for self determination are the kinds of themes that come out of it. And out of this mix also comes the Negro Leagues, because ultimately a push was made partly through the black press and others to organize the independent black baseball teams. And they finally met in February of 1920 here in Kansas City at the YMCA building, the colored YMCA building on Paseo Boulevard, which has its own unique history because it was built by the black community as a segregated YMCA. But they met there and hammered out the organization that would govern black baseball and develop what is called the Negro National League. And that would be the most enduring and successful of all the future Negro Leagues. And we will consider that the founding of Negro Leagues Baseball in February 1920, 101 years ago.
So I know that I've read in a bunch of places and seen a few documentaries where Rube Foster is kind of considered the architect of the Negro Leagues. Given what was going on leading up to the formation of the Negro National League, without Rube Foster, would we have still ended up in the same place with the formation of the league, or would somebody else have taken up the mantle and eventually done the same?
That's a good question. I'm not prepared to say that it wouldn't, and he certainly wasn't the only one driving this issue, but he was a driving force. It's hard to underestimate his contribution to the whole thing, primarily because of the long-standing success that he had with his team in Chicago. He had a lot of good connections with usage of stadiums around the country, especially in Chicago. He had developed a relationship with the Chicago White Sox to be able to use some of their facilities. And he had a great reputation both as a player and as a leader and manager. And he was just very smart and well organized. So when the push came for the meeting, he anticipated a lot of things. He showed up at the meeting with articles of incorporation for the leagues that he had developed. Apparently, according to news reports, this was a surprise to other leaders and owners. But he was able to forego and was elected the league president. But by doing so, he chose to forego any kind of so-called salary for that position. And didn't forego necessarily his leadership of Chicago team, but decided instead to take in 5% of the gate from every game. So that's how he made his money and put some money back into league structure. So he was always pushing for professionalism early on, and this was a means to an end in that regard for him, knowing that teams had to master scheduling, had to master travel, and other things. So his genius was the spark that certainly kept the thing going in very many respects. One could argue that it couldn't have happened without him, um, but it certainly was him driving the issue forward and making sure that there was at least a stability of success for the leagues and the teams to start out was certainly his genius.
And in that striving for professionalism, were they still running the barnstorming games, or was that pre-formation of the leagues? And how did record keeping look during those times?
First, let me try to define barnstorming as I think it should be appropriated, because it's a catchy word. It's something that people like to hang on to in terms of the romanticism of all this. But there is a distinction. Barnstorming without league play was teams kind of scheduling, well, not really even scheduling games per se, but just traveling. I mean, they were basically little traveling circuses when you think about it. The forward-thinking owners and managers were able to kind of create a tour for their teams. that they knew they were going to play here, here, and here, and here, get the accommodations set up and everything else. And even though they didn't have a league schedule to play, they had opponents they could play. That's not so much true barnstorming. Barnstorming is when you don't have any of that planned. You show up in town or you show up ahead of time and try to get games going. And sometimes they were prearranged and sometimes they weren't. And you tried to play all opponents that you could. That baseball was a lot like that before the structure of leagues. But then even once leagues were structured, um, teams supplemented their league play and pay by continuing to schedule games in between in different communities. It could be black teams, it could be white teams. For example, there could be a team in St. Louis, Missouri, traveling to play the league team in Chicago. And all along the way, heading north to Chicago, they could play in Peoria and other places, no matter levels of competition. And sometimes they would be invited to play. Sometimes they would create a network of games they would play annually. Maybe certain communities might invite them for a holiday game against their local town team, like the Independence Day or Labor Day here in the States. And they would develop this kind of rhythm with that and then go to Chicago and play their league scheduled games and maybe even additional exhibition games across the way in Gary, Indiana, or someplace west of Chicago just to earn additional money. So that could happen too. That happens a little bit later after Foster, but record keeping, they kept scorebooks as best they could, but for the most part, games were called into the different newspapers for reporting. They didn't necessarily have beat writers like the New York Yankees or others did. So a lot of the scorekeeping was kept obviously for record book sakes, and Mr. Foster kept a ledger and other things to keep track of wins, losses, and revenues, most importantly. Um, but a lot of the records, as we know it, have been lost to history, and historians have tried to find as much as they could where they could, but a lot of that is in the newspapers. Black newspapers are usually weekly newspapers written in the African American community. I think what I've discovered just in my own little bit of research is that early on, certain teams might have been covered a little bit more on a daily basis by the white mainstream papers. Um, but over time, it was the black weekly newspapers that really were the chroniclers of the game. And but a lot of the record keeping has been lost to history.
Okay. So we get to 1920. We have the first season of the Negro National League. I think there were about 14 teams at that point, and if I'm not mistaken, Chicago was the winner, right? First season.
Well, there weren't 14. It was maybe closer to 8 teams in the first season,
Okay.
and some teams didn't even make it through the entire season. Yeah, I believe Chicago was one of the was determined champions after the first season. But as you get closer to 1923, rival leagues formed. There was a Negro Southern League, a Southern Negro League, I should say. I forgive the switch of the words because there was another Negro Southern League that would come later, and they were not necessarily formally affiliated with the Negro National League, but some of those teams would be absorbed later. But then there was the Eastern Colored League in 1923, made up of teams that were primarily from the East, like in Philadelphia, New York, DC area, Baltimore area. Um, and they had a different structure. Most of the teams in the Midwest, I shouldn't say that they had a different structure, but they had different levels of leadership. And the unique thing about it was that most of those teams in the Negro National League in the Midwest were mostly black-owned enterprises, with the exception of the Kansas City Monarchs, which had a white owner in J.L. Wilkinson. In some respects, he was invited to try to form a team in Kansas City. It was the westernmost city in the circuit. It had a large growing black population. He had connections from other baseball enterprises that he had done and was able to create the team. But at the Eastern Color League had black ownership, but had a lot of leadership that was white through booking agents. and the booking agents were the ones who controlled access to the different ballparks. And keep in mind, at least in 1920, no black team owned their own ballpark. They either rented it from a major league or minor league team. Now that changes over time, but still there's only a couple of teams that are able to build their own ball fields on a regular basis. It was still an anomaly for them to have their own ball fields that they controlled. For the most part, they were at the mercy of renting those stadiums either through booking agents or working with the white major league or minor league teams at the time. But the teams kind of ebbed and flowed through the 20s, and some of them hung on, some of them um, uh, fell off, but most had persevered until really kind of a, I wouldn't say crisis point, but kind of an end point that gets us to 1929 with the stock market crash and the Great Depression coming on.
Okay. And so when the league gets off the ground, what does the average season look like? And can you talk? So I have a bit of a two-part question, not really related, but what does an average match day look like? What, how did they schedule games, especially if they're renting ballparks from major league teams who are probably, obviously playing most of the time? And secondly, part of when I was doing research, a couple of things that come out a lot is the socio-economic impact it had on the African American community. Can you talk a little bit about these two things?
So, if I could take the last question first, I mean, there are a lot of people who speculate about the socioeconomic impact, but I haven't found a lot of credible studies
Mhm.
on that. It's hard to say. I will say this though. I mean, they were small businesses in their own right. They did draw lots of attention and fans, especially the opening series of the seasons, which were usually early May. As you start to get in the 20s and 1930s, the teams would do spring training in places like Arkansas and Texas and maybe Florida. And then it wasn't spring training as we know it today, where everyone exercises and then they play exhibition games. No, they're starting to play exhibition games and then actually play their way up north to opening day and their home cities, playing against white teams, black teams, college teams, whomever would get a practice with them. And here in Kansas City, for example, opening day also included parades and beauty contests and things like that. So um, it's safe to say, though, that the stadiums that they rented were in the urban areas, some of them in what would become traditionally black neighborhoods, so to speak. Again, for example, here in Kansas City, that stadium took on a lot of names, but I think early on that was Association Park and then became Rupert Stadium. But it was owned by the New York Yankees farm team, the Kansas City Blues. So it's not far from our location here at the museum at 22nd in Brooklyn, which is had developed into an African American side of town. So it's in the heart of the black community, easy to access by trolley car and or walk to. So although it is kind of uphill going south, it was something that was easy for at least the black community to come and enjoy. Um, Match day, if you will, was usually, since they're renting the stadiums, were on Sundays for the most part, Saturdays and Sundays, and the minor league or major league team would play during the week. Most of the Negro League games are on the weekends, and then they would travel during the week um, when they could to play other teams and other games. Um, Early on, stadium crowds looked to be closer to 12 to 15,000, and in some places 20,000. Um, with ticket availability for any average fan. And again, these weren't necessarily segregated games per se. White fans could go to these games. I mean, and black fans could go watch white baseball too, but depending on the city rules, there might have been segregated seating. But that, for the most part, didn't seem to be the case with most black teams. It all depends on the community and the community norms. Um, And these teams made pretty decent money. There's not a lot of hard research on salaries, but percentage of gate was split between winner and loser based on who won or lost, and then that trickled down to paying for the facilities, then the owner taking their primary cut and then taking the rest to pay a little bit more for the manager and coaches, and then the players got their share. Maybe a star player got a little bit more of a share because of just who they were and things that they negotiated. For the most part, players were governed by a uniform players contract, which was copied from Major League Baseball, which also included a reserve clause that prevented players from jumping contracts, and ownership could kind of control where they would be traded. And there were trades and transactions in the leagues as well. And sometimes there were contracts that were ironclad, and sometimes contracts were not. And they didn't necessarily have formal commissioners per se, so uh, it wasn't it was often that players would jump their contracts to go and play for other teams, or what would mostly happen was that they might leave the league and team early and maybe get another opportunity playing in Latin America, Mexico, or Cuba or Puerto Rico, and do opportunities like that. So um, there was a lot of support from the community, and players did the best they could to make money where they could make money. And It was quite a time. There were times when it wasn't always as organized, but there were times when it was quite organized, and certainly the level of competition was very high.
So, being I'm of Latin American descent, and one of the things that I found most interesting was, I think I saw some stats where the league was about 10 to 15% Latin American players. Around when do we start to see some of the influx of Latin American players into the Negro Leagues?
Almost from the beginning, pre-Negro Leagues, because historian Adrian Burgos Jr. Really has his pulse on this and has researched it. And particularly places like Cuba is the fountainhead of baseball in the Caribbean, and its spread, uh, partly due to the influence of American military, but as early as the very early 1900s, you have young people coming to the United States from places like Cuba, studying in the United States, and learning baseball and bringing it back to the Caribbean. Um, and my understanding is that baseball leagues developed very early in the 1880s or so in places like Cuba and become part of the um, the industrial companies that are around there, especially those who are harvesting sugar and things like that. Um, and there, as I understand it too, that there are race issues in places like Cuba where there's black and white, and the leagues were segregated at first through black and white, but then quickly became integrated within the industrial leagues, and then the Cuban professional leagues kind of spawn out of that. And then they take baseball along with the influence of the American military to some other parts of the islands and things like that. With the development of those professional leagues, it opened up opportunities for early winter baseball. As early as 1910, this is obviously before the formation of the Negro National League, black players could go out to even California and play in the California Winter Leagues. And those leagues were not integrated either as far as players within teams, but there were integrated team play. So you could have American teams, white American teams, you could have Mexican American teams, and over time you get Japanese American teams playing up and down the coast in California. Um, and for and then after that, you can maybe play on the west coast of Mexico for winter baseball, and then you'd come back to the Caribbean and play through January through March or April, and then come back to the United States if you're a black player. And so you're playing baseball all year round. So if you're good, there are opportunities for you. Those race issues, though, in the Caribbean still manifest themselves in the United States. So there were, I guess, what you might call white Cubans who actually played Major League Baseball. even on teams like Cincinnati Reds, most notably Adolfo Luque, who's this outstanding player, and some others. But a player like Jose Mendez, called the Black Diamond, was a player manager for the Kansas City Monarchs. He was darker skinned, so if he wanted to play in the United States, he played in the Negro Leagues. And the early Monarchs teams, they had Mendez, and they had a couple of other Latino players on their roster, including the players who helped them win the 1924 First Negro League World Series.
And if
Sorry,
you could talk, if you could talk a little bit as well, because from what I understand, the roster sizes were fairly small. How did that influence style of play and just player development in general? Because I mean, I'm assuming they would probably have to cover multiple positions, pitch, field, everything, right?
Yeah, and player development is quite a statement.
Yeah.
Again, you do have to you really can't look at it, the Negro Leagues, other than that fact that there's ball and bat and the rules were the same. The lens of MLB, and especially modern MLB, can't not be placed on black baseball back then. But to your question, uh, the lineups were smaller and guys did play multiple positions, and many of them played them well. I mean, I speak of Mendez, for example. He was in his playing days, he was primarily a pitcher. Even as a manager, he was a pitcher, but he also played shortstop. Um, Here's another a little bit later, Martin de Higo from Cuba, best known as a pitcher, but he could hit 400. Wilbur Bullet Rogan, one of the early champions on the Monarchs teams, also hit very well and played the outfield. It was not uncommon for guys to pitch and play first base or do other things, which also allowed them to also serve as relief pitchers if necessary. You don't get unless they were really special, you don't get a lot of specialization until later on. I mean, Satchel Paige, the great Satchel Paige, later on, he has to hit too, but he wasn't a great hitter. He was primarily a pitcher. But for the most part, yes, a lot of players, Leon Day and many others, played multiple positions, played them well, even though they might have pitched as well. Uh, um, and then there's guys like Ted Double Duty Radcliffe, again, coming along a little bit later, who would pitch and catch. And it's said that he once pitched one end of a doubleheader and caught the other end of a doubleheader. So, which meant roster sizes, for the most part, were closer to 12, maybe 19 players. Certainly not 26 to 28 that we have today in Major League Baseball.
So that's an interesting piece because part of our fascination today is judging, and obviously for good reason. We look at stats and how wholesome they are, and we judge players accordingly. But it's really impossible to just look at it from a statistical perspective when we're talking about the Negro Leagues, because you have to appreciate beyond just the figures or what you see, right? So players like Josh Gibson, and that's something we were talking. If you just look at his official stats, it's about 113 home runs, but a lot of places you hear that he even hit 84 home runs in a season, and like a lot of that has been lost to history, right?
Yeah, but at the same time, again, it's not apples to oranges, but it's kind of more apples to pears. Similar looking fruits, slightly different taste. Um, and because of what is available, again, it's hard to look. I always caution folks, don't try to look at the Negro Leagues through the same lens as Major League Baseball. I know that's hard to do because you want to try to figure out, well, how do I make equivalencies to this? And because we are sometimes stuck in trying to prove someone's worth based on the analytics. You can't do that with the Negro Leagues. One, because the data's not there. And I'll go as far as saying the data will never be there. Not to the satisfactory point of someone who completely relies on the data. And part of that is because it's been lost to history. At the same time, as I noted earlier, teams had league games, and then they had extra games. And that was kind of the nature of the Negro Leagues in order to sustain themselves. So what data do you count where it survives? Now, you've probably heard about the news of the elevation of Negro Leagues to Major League status.
Mm-hmm.
The data that's currently being considered is just the league game status. So data. So that is going to look paltry analytically compared to what other teams and players have done. But it's a broader story than that. I will say this, there are people working very diligently to try to complete that record as much as possible, but they're never going to get to the very end because the records just don't exist, not in a robust enough way to get to all of them. And so I'm doubtful we'll ever get a complete total record, but we'll get enough that these folks can be entered into the conversation. And there's enough historical information that's not just folklore, that's not just anecdotal or apocryphal, that can prove that these people were good and talented. But it's less important to me whether Gibson is the all-time home run leader. That's not even the most important part of the story. The most part of the story to me is the fact that we can connect his story to explaining parts of our American story, our American experience, in particular the Great Migration of African Americans, which his family endured from Bona Vista, Georgia, to Pittsburgh. Folks moving north, trying to find jobs, trying to escape racism and Jim Crow and sharecropping, to become part of the industrial Pittsburgh, and ultimately his baseball talent at a teenager wins out and he becomes a meteoric star, but dies at 35.
And
that's more important to me than however many home runs he hit. Just understanding that and how that relates to other Black people in America.
100%. So in the interest of time, we just want to move towards integration. So obviously, one of the questions that always gets asked is, Jackie Robinson may not have been the best player in the Negro Leagues, but he was absolutely the right person to break the color barrier. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, that seems to be the consensus among historians as well as some of his contemporaries. And people will often talk about, well, were certain players jealous of him or this or that, because he wasn't, when they say he wasn't the best player, it's because he wasn't a known commodity for baseball or having a lot of experience in baseball, at least professionally, and certainly not compared to other contemporaries like, say, a Monty Irvin or even a Roy Campanella, who would ultimately become his teammate in the major leagues. Robinson, though, he doesn't just pop out of the blue, so to speak, at least in the Black community, because they know who he was. He was a minor celebrity at best from his collegiate athletic days at UCLA, playing football, running track. He was a national star in that regard. His brother was an Olympian. Mack Robinson was an Olympian with Jesse Owens in the 1936 Olympics. People knew who he was. They didn't really know him for baseball, but he played baseball in junior college and in college. And after the military, when he was drafted and subsequently court-martialed for not moving to the back of a bus on a military base, and was honorably discharged after that, beating a court-martial, he needed a job and found the Monarchs, who were depleted from the war. A lot of the major leagues and the Negro Leagues were depleted of players during the World War II draft. The talent level was still a little bit higher by comparison in the Negro Leagues because there were just less players affected. But teams like Kansas City Monarchs still needed players, and Robinson got his opportunity. So people had heard of him. They knew about him. He had a decent season in 1945 with the Monarchs. But all these other forces were kind of coming together in 1945. The political pressures on baseball in New York in particular, to try to do something about integration as a labor issue, the media pressures, both from black media and even questions in certain aspects of the white media, if you will, on this issue of integration. The war effort itself, where black soldiers have fought valiantly again, as they did in World War One, uh, and were proving their worth to the country, and certainly still not getting certain rights at home, among them being able to play professional baseball. And then finally, this kind of long brewing plan of Dodgers general manager Branch Rickey to figure out a way to get black talent onto his team. And all these things are just kind of coming together and converged ultimately on Robinson. and At 26 years old, kind of old for a rookie player, but he had a lot of different athletic and life experiences that, at least for Mr. Rickey, felt that those would serve him well in this very daunting task that he had to take on. And it proved to be correct. Um, I mentioned players like Monty Irvin, who ultimately get a chance to go to New York Giants, and he might have been among the first to be considered. Excuse me. He had spent time in the military before Robinson, had some ankle injuries as well, but his experience, like Robinson's, was not good in the military. Left him maybe a little bit bitter at first, and probably felt he talked about that Robinson was a little bit stronger than he was to jump right into that situation. And he didn't think that he could be, but ultimately he did, and had a great deal of success. Um, and I think to a man, at least people like Satchel Paige, who many thought probably should have been first, just because of his notoriety. But Paige was kind of on the downside of his career in many respects, but still a big draw, outstanding talent. But even he said that he would say that he didn't think he could take the abuse that Robinson took. And so Robinson understood the gravity of the situation, and rose to the challenge in many respects, and in some respects against his normal nature. It wasn't like him to suffer fools lightly or to put up with any kind of racist attitude. But Branch Rickey asked him to kind of quell his energies on that, stay in control in order for things to work out. And then after a certain time, he could let loose, and that's what happened. And he became one of the most important athletes uh, in world history, if you ask me.
Yeah, and it's just very interesting. I found just a comment that it's and we hear so much, and like you said, this consensus he wasn't the best player, but it's not as if he was no slouch, right? I mean, he
Right.
won Rookie of the Year and he won MVP within the first 3 years playing baseball. So it's pretty interesting. I always find that fascinating.
One of the things that I want to add as well, I was listening to one of your other interviews, and just to kind of tie it into Canada, since we're in Canada, was the impact that he had on Willie O'Ree, when he was, for those who don't know, was the first black hockey player in the NHL. When Willie mentioned that he wanted to play hockey, Jackie Robinson didn't discourage him from doing it. He encouraged him and said, go and do it if that's what you want to do.
Yeah, I've had the honor of meeting Mr. O'Ree, and we've done a couple programs with him. Fascinating story because he loved hockey to start, but his dad wanted him to play baseball, and he had some talent with that. And he treasures having met Jackie Robinson as a young baseball player, and Robinson told Robinson about wanting to play hockey, and Robinson encouraging him. And for those who don't know the story, though, O'Ree did try to play baseball. He actually got as high as the low minor leagues in the Braves organization. One of the more poignant stories he told was leaving Nova Scotia for the bus to go to spring training, getting down to the United States and getting to the Kentucky border on the bus. And he could sit where he wanted before that, but once they crossed the Kentucky border, he had to move to the back of the bus. He was
Right.
devastated. and just had a miserable time trying to play baseball until he called his father and said, "Look, I tried. I don't like it. I want to come home." And then that's when his father relented, and then he got right back into hockey and became a legendary hockey player.
So I just want to ask one more thing about integration. Sorry, not taking too much time here, but um, this is something I learned. So obviously, racism was the big issue, and that's why it took as long as it did to break the color barrier. But the other thing I read was it was a pretty good gig for major leagues, like having the Negro Leagues around. Like they were making a lot of money off them, right? Renting the stadiums, taking a cut from the gate receipts, making money off concessions. And I saw in one of the programs, actually a storied on the website for the Negro League Baseball Museum, that the Yankees made $100,000 in 1945 of the Negro Leagues. I mean, it's kind of tough to give up a gig like that, no?
Yeah, but they weren't as progressive as they could have been either.
Mm-hmm.
So how did that work? So the Yankees own Yankee Stadium, obviously, which they rented out to the Negro Leagues for Sunday 4-team doubleheaders. They own the minor league park in Newark, New Jersey, that was rented by the Newark Eagles Negro Leagues team. They own the minor league stadium here in Kansas City, which was part for the Kansas City Blues minor league team, their minor league team. So they're making money all up and down this enterprise as well. But they were also a team not only making money, but it's fair to say that they had successful players. They had successful teams with just all white players. They were, I wouldn't say perennial champions even then, but they had a lot of success. So they felt that they weren't in a hurry to integrate. But I remarked that one of the films in our museum, and one of the commentators talks about the fact that, the Yankees could have been more progressive if they were about winning. They could have had an outfield of Mickey Mantle, Willie Mays, and Henry Aaron if they wanted it. At a certain point in the 50s during integration, those players were out there and available, and other scouts saw them. He said, "Do you mean the Yankee scouts didn't see them?" So if they were truly about winning,
Mm-hmm.
they could have grabbed those players, and ultimately they did not. And he surmised that just the leadership of the team was just not progressive enough and were racist. So in addition to making the money, they just weren't interested. But now the New York Giants became interested and got players like Monty Irvin, got players like Hank Thompson, and ultimately they were the ones who landed Willie Mays, and it did lead to some championships for them. And the Dodgers were very aggressive with Robinson, ultimately briefly for Dan Bankhead, but other players like Joe Black, um, Roy Campanella, and Don Newcomb, aggressive in getting top talent. And the Dodgers were more snake bit as far as the championships, but they would go to the playoffs perennially for a little while. So, and ultimately did win the World Series in the mid to late 50s. So, the success of these teams really depended on their leadership, looking past the social mores of the time. You have what between 1947 and 1959, when all the teams were able to integrate with at least one black or Afro-Latino player on their roster, about 120 players in this time period. That's how long it takes for full integration, if you will, in baseball. But the players are dominating in most valuable player awards. They're dominating in Rookie of the Year awards. Many of their teams are going to the World Series. Most of those teams that recruit them are in the National League, and the National League dominates the All-Star game. This is the greatest influx of athletic talent in history, period. And it was a missed opportunity for those teams who move slow. Even my favorite team, the St. Louis Cardinals, were among the slowest of teams to get black and Latino players. Well, once they did, it was great because that meant Lou Brock and Bob Gibson and Bill White and Julian Javier and Orlando Cepeda, and those teams, as you get into the 60s, began to win championships.
All right, so Ray, in the interest of time, and I know you have another speaking engagement after this, I think this is a good point to end it off on. But we really appreciate your time. This has been very informative. I hope our listeners have enjoyed this as much as we have. But can you just let people know how they can find you? Is the museum still open? Can they still visit at this time, or?
Well, the museum's been open since June of last year after the early pandemic shutdown. So we've been trucking on. Folks can come and certainly visit us in person. We do have reduced operating hours from normal, but we are open still Tuesday through Saturday and Sunday here in Kansas City. We're doing a lot more virtual programming through our Facebook page. So you might see announcements of different events, book readings, I should say, for families, as well as historical readings and discussions of Negro Leagues history, usually through our Facebook and YouTube channels. So just watch Facebook for those announcements. We are grateful for the number of members we have across the country and North America as well. So membership and donations are certainly welcome. You can see that on our website at www.nlbm.com. So there are ways you can contribute and buy books and research materials, video, as well as caps and shirts and all kinds of things to help support our cause.
So that's a very good one. Last question I want to ask, because that is something I wanted to ask. Is there any book or in particular that you would recommend our viewers? I know I'm probably going to go out and get one. So,
well, it really does depend on how deep down the rabbit hole you want to go with this history. I would say, but a good book to start with is by Professor Leslie Heaphy, Heaphy. She teaches at Kent State, and her book, The Negro Leagues, I think is 1859 and 1960. I think I got those dates right. That's a good college textbook, good high school textbook to start with, and you should be as expert on just as anybody on the basic history of the Negro Leagues after reading that. I would add Adrian Burgos's Playing America's Game, which covers a lot of the Negro Leagues and the connections to Latin American baseball. And between the two of those books, you could be a baseball genius, frankly, on this topic.
I would love that.
And there are others, but start with those two. And then if you wanted to start getting into statistics and lists, there are other books that you can find.
And we'll add those two books into the description. We'll put links to them, and also we'll put links to the to I guess your Facebook page and your website, so people can find you. But again, Ray, we really appreciate this. This has been fantastic. To our listeners and viewers, if you have any comments, feel free to contact us. Let us know. Instagram at Box-and-One-Pod, on Twitter as well. Just let us know what you thought. If you have any questions, Ray, hopefully we can have you on again at some point because I know we have a lot more questions that we haven't been able to get to.
Yeah, we're glad to be a part of it, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ray.
Hopefully see you soon. Thank you, Remy.